September 18th, 2018. Greene County, Iowa. The air that morning carried the smell of wet soil and diesel, the kind that settles deep into your chest and stays there. By sunrise, the gravel lot outside Harper Equipment had already filled with pickup trucks' trailers, and men who had been farming longer than the highway out front had existed. 40 brand-new tractors stood in a perfect line, green paint shining under a pale sky, each one stamped with the name everyone trusted for generations, John Deere. But this wasn't a celebration. 83 farmers had been called, and each one told to bring their old machines for trade-in. Most of those machines had worked their fields for decades. Some had belonged to fathers, some to grandfathers. Some carried dents that told stories no one else remembered. And then, one by one, the numbers came back. 0. Trade-in value $0. No negotiation. No reconsideration. Just a printed sheet slid across a folding table like a verdict. You could hear it ripple through the crowd. Not loud at first, just a shifting of boots, a tightening of jaws. The kind of silence that only shows up when people don't yet know how angry they are. At the edge of the lot near the last trailer, a man stood beside a faded 1974 tractor. The paint had dulled to a tired green, the metal worn smooth, in places where hands had rested for years. The name Ethan Cole wasn't one most people said out loud, mostly because he never gave them much reason to. He didn't argue, didn't step forward, didn't even look at the paper when they handed it to him. He just stood there, one hand resting on the hood of the machine, like he was waiting for it to say something back. And that was the part nobody noticed yet, because what happened that day would change how everyone in Greene County saw worthless machines forever. The man running the operation moved like he owned more than just the lot. Daniel Harper wasn't just a dealer, he was the dealer. His family's name had been on that building for over 30 years, and over time it had grown into something larger than a business. It was power, credit lines, decisions that determined who planted in the spring and who didn't. He wore a pressed shirt that didn't belong anywhere near a field. Sleeves rolled just enough to look practical, not enough to get dirty. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Gentlemen," he said, standing in front of the lineup of new tractors, one hand resting casually on the hood of the nearest one. "These machines right here represent the future of farming. Efficiency, precision, liability." A few heads nodded, not because they agreed, but because they needed to. He picked up one of the printed sheets. "And what you've brought in?" He paused just long enough for people to lean in. "Is not part of that future." A murmur rolled through the crowd. "Now I understand." Daniel continued, his tone soft. "But cutting, some of you are attached to your equipment. Sentimental value, as I mean, family history. I respect that." He smiled then. Not kindly. "But sentiment doesn't plant crops, and it sure doesn't make a machine worth anything." That was when the laughter started, not from everyone, but enough. The kind of laughter that spreads quickly when people are uncomfortable, when they don't want to be the ones standing on the wrong side of the moment. Daniel stepped down from the platform and began walking along the row of old tractors lined up for inspection. He stopped in front of one, tapped a rusted panel with his knuckle, shook his head. "Scrap. Another. Outdated. Another. Liability." Each word landed heavier than the last. Then he reached the end of the line. Ethan's tractor sat slightly apart from the others, not by design, but because Ethan had parked it that way. Like he didn't quite believe it belonged in the same category. Daniel circled it slowly, taking in the faded paint, the worn tires, the hand-polished edges where time had erased the factory finish. "Well," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "this one's still alive, I suppose." A few chuckles. He looked over at Ethan. "You planning to farm with this?" he asked. "Or keep it as a museum piece?" Ethan didn't answer, didn't even look at him. Daniel let the silence stretch, then laughed lightly, turning back to the crowd. "This," he said, placing a hand flat against the tractor's hood, is exactly the kind of thinking that keeps small operations from growing. Holding on to the past like it's going to save you, he glanced back at Ethan. Eyes narrowing just slightly. Truth is, he added, machines like this aren't just outdated. They're useless. That word hung there, useless. Someone in the back laughed louder this time. A few others joined in more out of habit than conviction. Daniel picked up the clipboard. Trade-in value. He read, then looked up with a thin smile. $0. He extended the papers toward Ethan. Sign here, he said. And we'll get you into something that actually works. For a moment, nothing moved. The wind shifted across the lot, carrying dust between the rows of machines. Ethan finally looked up, not at the paper, not at Daniel, but at the line of brand new tractors behind him, then back at his own. He ran his hand slowly along the metal fingers, tracing a groove worn in by years of use. There was something almost careful in the way he did it, like he was reading something no one else could see. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Too quiet for most of the crowd to catch. I don't need a loan, he said. Daniel blinked. I didn't say anything about a loan, he replied. A hint of amusement creeping in. You didn't have to, Ethan said. That got a few looks. Daniel's smile tightened. Well, he said you might not need one today. But come harvest season, when that thing breaks down in the middle of a field. He shrugged. We'll see how far pride gets you. A few nods. A few more laughs. Ethan took the paper, looked at it for exactly 1 second, then folded it once clean and precise and handed it back. I'm not signing, he said. The laughter stopped, not all at once, but enough. Daniel's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes shifted. You understand? He said slowly. That without a trade-in, without a financing agreement, you won't qualify for our service program. Parts, repairs, support. Ethan nodded once. I understand. And you're fine with that. Another nod. There was a pause, then longer than before. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only the men nearest could hear, but loud enough that everyone leaned in anyway. Then you're not just stubborn, he said. You're making a mistake. Ethan didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't defend himself, and somehow that made it worse. Because in a place like that, silence doesn't look like strength. It looks like defeat. Daniel straightened up, turning back to the crowd with a dismissive wave. Gentlemen, he said, we'll proceed with those who are ready to move forward. The line began to shift again. Papers were signed. Agreements made. Men who had come in with machines that still ran were now committing to years of payments they weren't entirely sure they could afford. And at the far end of the lot, Ethan Cole climbed back onto his tractor. The engine didn't start right away. It never did. There was a pause, a low mechanical hesitation that made a few people glance over some with smirks already forming. Then it turned, slow at first, then steady, a deep, grounded sound that didn't try to impress anyone. Ethan didn't look back as he drove off the lot, didn't see the way some of the men watched him go, didn't hear the quiet comment someone muttered under their breath. Guy's gonna regret that. Maybe he would. But there was something nobody there understood yet, because this story was never really about the trade-in, and it wasn't really about the machine either. To understand that, you have to go back a little further. Back before the lot, before the paperwork, before a man in a pressed shirt decided what something was worth. Back to a stretch of land just outside Jefferson, where the soil runs darker than most places, and the wind doesn't carry noise, it carries memory. Ethan Cole didn't inherit much by most people's standards. No large operation, no modern equipment, no financial cushion waiting in a bank. What he inherited was quieter than that. 38 acres of land that had never once been sold outside the family, a farmhouse that leaned slightly to the west. Not because it was poorly built, but because the ground beneath it had settled over time in ways no blueprint could predict. And a machine. That same tractor, it had belonged to his father, Thomas Cole. And before that, it had belonged to a man who never lived long enough to see Ethan born, but whose name still showed up in old receipts tucked into the back of drawers. Thomas wasn't the kind of man people remembered for talking. He was the kind they remembered for fixing things. Not quickly, not loudly, but correctly. He had a way of listening to machines that most people didn't understand. He'd stand beside an engine head, tilted slightly, eyes half closed like he was trying to catch a sentence that hadn't quite been finished yet. "Machines don't lie," he used to say. "They tell you exactly what's wrong. You just have to know how to listen." Ethan learned that. Before learned much else. Before school mattered. Before money made sense. Before the idea of new meant anything more than unproven. He learned that every sound had meaning, that a vibration wasn't just a flaw, it was a message. That sometimes what looked worn out wasn't weak, it was seasoned. There was one winter 1996 when the cold came early and stayed longer than anyone expected. Fuel lines froze across the county. Engines refused to turn. Men who had relied on newer machines found themselves standing in silent fields, waiting for something that wouldn't start. Thomas didn't wait. He took the tractor apart, piece by piece in the barn, not to replace it, but to understand it better. Nights stretched into mornings, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging above a workbench, worn smooth by years of use. Ethan would sit nearby, half asleep, listening to the quiet rhythm of tools against metal. That winter something changed, not in the way the tractor looked, but in the way it worked. Thomas never wrote it down, never explained it fully, but he adjusted things, small, precise changes that didn't show up on any manual. Torque distribution, fuel flow, timing, not in a way that made the machine louder or faster, but in a way that made it endure. By spring, while others were still waiting on parts, that tractor was already in the field, working, steady, uncompromising. And that was the part Ethan never forgot. Because what his father built wasn't just a machine that ran. He built something that understood the land it worked on. And years later, standing in a gravel lot with a piece of paper that said it was worth nothing, Ethan knew something no one else there did. He wasn't holding on to the past. He was holding on to something they had never taken the time to understand. And that was where the real story begins. The road back to Ethan Cole's land cut through a stretch of fields that had already begun to turn under the weight of the season. The sky hung low that afternoon, clouds pressing down like something unfinished. He didn't rush the drive. Never did. The tractor moved at its own pace, steady and unbothered. Its engine settling into that familiar rhythm that most people would have called outdated. But to Ethan, it sounded like certainty. By the time he reached the edge of his property, the noise from town had already faded. No more voices, no more laughter, no more numbers printed on paper telling him what something was worth. Just wind, just soil, just time. But there was something else now, something that hadn't been there before that morning. Pressure. It didn't come loudly. It didn't show itself all at once. It settled in quietly, like a storm you can feel long before you see it. Because word travels fast in places like Greene County. By that evening, people were already talking. At the diner on Main Street. At the co-op. At the gas pump, where conversations linger longer than they should. Ethan turned down the deal. He walked away from $0 like it didn't matter. He thinks that old thing's gonna carry him through harvest. Some said it with disbelief. Some with concern. And a few with something closer to relief. Like they were glad it wasn't them standing alone like that. But the truth was, most of them had already signed. Most of them had already committed. And once you've done that, you don't question it out loud. You just hope you were right. The next morning, a letter arrived. Not hand-delivered. Not discussed. Just placed in the mailbox at the end of Ethan's gravel road, like any other piece of mail. Harper Equipment letterhead. Inside, the words were clean, professional, final. Due to non-participation in the trade-in and financing program. Service priority and parts access would be limited for independent operators effective immediately. No threats, no anger, just exclusion. Ethan read it once, folded it, set it on the kitchen table beside a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, and then he went outside, because whatever came next wasn't going to be decided in that kitchen. It was going to be decided in the field. The first week passed quietly, too quietly. The sky held the ground softened just enough, and for a moment, It almost felt like nothing had changed. Ethan worked his land the same way he always had, measured patient, never forcing the soil to do something it wasn't ready for. But beyond his fence line, things were shifting. The new tractors had begun their work. 40 machines spread across the county, each one equipped with systems that promised precision down to the inch. GPS alignment, automated depth control, sensors that adjusted in real time. And at first, it looked like Daniel Harper had been right. Fields were turning faster, straighter, cleaner. Men who had hesitated at the lot now stood a little taller beside their new equipment. There's a certain confidence that comes with believing you've stepped into the future, especially when that future shines under the sun and hums with controlled power. Daniel made sure people saw it. He drove from field to field in his truck, stopping to check on operations, offering advice that sounded more like reassurance. Give it time, he'd say. You'll wonder how you ever worked without it. And for a while, they believed him. But there was something nobody accounted for, something no system had factored in. The rain came early, not a storm, not at first, just a steady, persistent fall that stretched across days instead of hours. The kind that doesn't flood immediately, but changes the ground slowly, deeply, until what once held firm begins to shift under your feet. At first it wasn't a problem. Then the soil started to give. Then the low fields began to pool, and then quietly, the machines started to struggle. It began with small things, sensors misreading depth because the ground no longer responded the way it had been programmed to. Traction systems adjusting too aggressively, overcompensating in mud that didn't behave predictably. Engines working harder, not because they lacked power, but because they were trying to follow instructions that no longer matched reality. A few farmers brushed it off. Just a glitch, needs recalibration. Dealer said it's normal in wet conditions, but the rain didn't stop, and the ground didn't return to what it had been. By the second week, the problems were no longer small. Machines stalled in fields that had been worked for generations. Tires spun without grip. Systems shut down mid-operation, flashing warnings no one had seen before. And suddenly, speed didn't matter anymore. Precision didn't matter, because nothing was moving. Daniel Harper stood at the edge of one of the larger fields, sinking slightly into the mud, watching as a nearly new tractor struggled to pull a basic load through soil that had turned against it. It's the conditions, he said more to himself than anyone else. Unusual saturation levels. The engineer beside him nodded quickly. We can adjust the parameters, he said. It just needs time. Time. That was the one thing the farmers didn't have, because harvest wasn't going to wait, and neither was the weather. What happened next was the part nobody forgot. It started with a single field. Not one of the big operations. Not one of the men who had spoken loudest at the lot. Just a mid-sized farm on the east side of the county, where the soil had always been a little heavier, a little more stubborn. The machine stalled before noon. By evening, it hadn't moved an inch. Word spread again. Different this time. Not whispers. Calls. Questions. Did yours stop too? Are you getting that warning? Dealer says they're working on it. But what do we do now? And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, someone said Ethan's name. Not loudly. Not with confidence. Just quietly enough to be heard. I saw him out yesterday, one man said. Field behind his place. Another frowned. In this, the first man nodded. Didn't look stuck. That was all it took. Because doubt doesn't need much to grow. The next morning, 2 trucks turned off the main road and followed the gravel path to Ethan's land. Then 3 more. Then a few men on foot who had heard just enough to want to see it for themselves. They didn't announce themselves, didn't call ahead. They just stood at the edge of the field, watching. Ethan was already there. The tractor moved slowly across the uneven ground, cutting through soil that had swallowed other machines whole. The tires sank, but not too deep. The engine didn't strain. It didn't fight the mud. It worked with it. That was the difference. And if you didn't know what to look for, you might miss it. But there was something else, something no one there could explain. Because that machine, the same one that had been called worthless just days before, wasn't just moving, it was pulling. A load heavier than most of the newer tractors, had managed in dry conditions. One of the men stepped closer, squinting. "That doesn't make sense," he muttered. Another shook his head. "No, it doesn't. But there was a reason. There always is." And it went back further than any of them realized. Back to that winter. Back to a man who didn't believe in replacing things just because they were old. Thomas Cole had never trusted systems that thought for you. He believed in systems you could feel. So when he worked on that tractor, he didn't upgrade it. He rebalanced it, adjusted the way power moved through it. Not just how much power it had. Shifted torque so it didn't surge and slip, but held steady under resistance. Modified the fuel flow so the engine didn't react instantly, but consistently. Small changes, invisible changes, the kind no dealership would ever document, the kind no software would ever replicate, because they weren't designed for perfect conditions. They were designed for real ones. And now standing at the edge of a field that had brought modern machines to a halt, those changes were finally being seen, but not understood, not yet, because even as the crowd grew, even as more people arrived to watch something they couldn't quite explain, there was still one person who hadn't come, one person who hadn't seen it with his own eyes, Daniel Harper. And when he finally did, that was when everything changed. Daniel Harper didn't arrive quietly. You could hear his truck before you saw it. Tires cutting through wet gravel with more force than necessary, engine revving, like the noise itself might reassert control over a situation that had begun slipping away from him. By the time he stepped out, the field was already lined with men, not standing in groups anymore, just standing, watching. Ethan's tractor moved across the far side, slow and deliberate, carving a path through soil that had swallowed machines worth 10 times as much. The engine didn't roar. It didn't struggle. It simply held its ground, like it had already decided how this was going to end. Daniel took a few steps forward, boots sinking slightly with each one. "What am I looking at?" he asked, though the answer was right in front of him. No one rushed to respond, because for the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't the one explaining things. One of the farmers finally spoke. "It's been running all morning," he said. "Didn't stall once." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's not possible," he replied almost too quickly. "Not in this kind of soil." But there it was, moving, working, ignoring everything that had been said about what should and shouldn't be possible. Ethan reached the end of the row and eased the tractor to a stop. The engine idled low, steady as a heartbeat. He didn't turn it off right away. Just sat there for a moment, looking out over the field, like he was measuring something no one else could see. Then he climbed down. The crowd shifted slightly as he walked toward them. Not out of fear, but out of something closer to uncertainty. Daniel stepped forward to meet him. "Mind explaining this?" he asked, gesturing toward the tractor, his voice controlled but strained. Ethan glanced at the field, then back at Daniel. "It's working," he said simply. A few men let out quiet breaths, almost like they'd been holding them without realizing it. Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I mean, how? That machine shouldn't even be able to pull half that load in dry conditions, let alone..." He stopped himself, gesturing at the mud around them. "Unless..." He narrowed his eyes slightly. "You've done something to it." There it was. Not curiosity, suspicion. Because when something challenges what you believe to be true, the first instinct isn't to understand it. It's to question it. Ethan didn't react right away. He walked back toward the tractor, placing a hand on the hood like he had on the lot days before. For a moment, it looked like he wasn't going to answer at all. Then he spoke. "My father worked on it," he said. Daniel frowned. "Worked on it how?" Ethan ran his fingers along the edge of the metal, finding that same worn groove. He didn't like how it handled wet ground, he said. Said the power came too fast, made it slip. A few of the older farmers exchanged looks because they knew exactly what he meant. "He changed the way it delivers torque," Ethan continued. "Smoothed it out. Made it hold instead of surge." Daniel crossed his arms. "That's not how these systems are designed," he said. "There are standards. Standards are for average conditions," Ethan replied quietly. That stopped him, not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. Because it wasn't said to impress anyone. It was said like something that had been understood for a long time. Ethan looked out across the field again. He didn't build it for average, he added. Silence settled over the group. Not uncomfortable this time, just heavy. Daniel looked back at the tractor, then at the fields beyond it where his new machines sat. Stalled their clean lines, now streaked with mud. Their systems waiting for instructions that no longer applied. For the first time since he'd stepped out of his truck, he didn't have an answer. What happened next, someone would later say, was the part nobody saw coming. Because Ethan didn't climb back onto the tractor to prove anything. He didn't rev the engine or push it harder for the sake of a moment. Instead, he turned to the men gathered there, some who had laughed days before, some who had signed papers they couldn't undo, and some who simply didn't know what to believe anymore. If you need help, he said, bring your machines. No speech, no pride, just an offer. At first, no one moved. Then Chaman stepped forward, then another. And by that afternoon, Ethan's field wasn't just his anymore. It became a place where broken schedules, stalled equipment, and rising fear all met something quieter, something steadier. One by one, tractors were brought in. Some needed small adjustments, weight distribution, tire pressure changes that didn't come from a manual, but from experience. Others needed more. Ethan didn't rush, didn't charge, didn't remind anyone of what had been said at the lot. He just worked, and in doing so something shifted, not just in the soil, but in the way people looked at things they thought they understood. By the end of that week, fields that had stood still were moving again. Not perfectly, not easily, but enough. Enough to save crops that would have otherwise been lost. Enough to change what people believed was possible. Daniel Harper returned to his office that night and closed the door behind him. For a long time, no one knew what he was doing in there. But the next morning, a notice went out. Short, direct. All previously assessed trade-in values would be reevaluated. Independent equipment inspections would be permitted. Service access restrictions lifted. No apology, not in words, but in action. And in a place like Greene County, that was enough. The weeks that followed didn't turn Ethan Cole into something he wasn't. He didn't become louder, didn't start chasing attention, or turning his land into something it had never been. If anything, he stayed exactly the same. The only difference was that people came to him now, not because he asked them to, but because they had seen something they couldn't ignore. Men who had once stood in that gravel lot and laughed now stood in his barn, asking questions they hadn't thought to ask before. How did you know? What did your father change? Can this be done to mine? Ethan never answered the same way twice. Sometimes he showed them. Sometimes he let them listen. Sometimes he just handed them a tool and stepped back. Because what his father had taught him wasn't something you could explain in a single sentence. It was something you had to learn, slowly, patiently, over time. And as for Daniel, he stopped laughing. That was the first change. The second was quieter. He started listening more. Walking fields instead of just inspecting them, asking questions he used to answer too quickly. He never admitted he had been wrong, not directly, but there were moments brief, almost unnoticeable, where he would pause a little longer than before when looking at an older machine, like he was seeing it for the first time, like he wasn't entirely sure what it was capable of anymore. Years later, people would still talk about that season, not because of the rain, not because of the machines, but because of what it revealed, about value, about knowledge, about the difference between something that looks advanced and something that actually understands the work it's meant to do. And if you ask anyone who was there, they'll tell you the same thing. It wasn't the day the tractors arrived that mattered. It was the day a man refused to sign a piece of paper telling him something was worthless, when he knew it wasn't. Because the truth is, not everything that's old, not everything that's new is better, and not everything that's been priced at zero has no value. Sometimes the things the world moves past too quickly are the very things that carry us through when everything else fails. Out on that same stretch of land just outside Jefferson, the soil still turns under the same sky. The wind still carries the same quiet weight. And every so often, if you're there early enough in the morning, you can hear it. Not loud, not trying to be heard. Just steady, an engine that doesn't rush, a machine that doesn't need to prove anything, and a man who never needed anyone else to tell him what it was worth. because he already knew.